September 17, 1918, 6,000 feet above the Meuse-Argonne sector of France. Second Lieutenant Frank Luke, Jr. of the 27th Aero Squadron peers through the wind-whipped struts of his SPAD S-13 biplane, goggles already frosting in the open cockpit. Below him, German observation balloons drift like fat targets against the autumn sky. His fabric-covered wings shudder in the turbulence, held together by wire and wood and prayers. The engine sputters, its 220 horsepower barely enough to keep the fragile machine aloft. Luke adjusts his leather helmet, feeling the bite of cold at 60 miles per hour, and pushes the stick forward into a dive. His single Vickers machine gun, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, holds exactly 500 rounds. In the seat beside him, nothing but empty air and the howl of wind. No radio, no radar, no backup. Just a compass, an altimeter that might be accurate, and his own eyes scanning for the enemy. This is aerial combat in 1918, a gentleman's duel fought in open cockpits where frostbite kills as surely as bullets. 25 years later, May 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above the English Channel, Captain Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group sits in the enclosed cockpit of his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, 8 50-caliber machine guns loaded with 3,400 rounds of ammunition. The temperature outside is 40 degrees below zero, but he's warm inside his heated flight suit, breathing pure oxygen through a mask connected to a pressurized system. His radio crackles with voices from 20 other fighters in his formation, all coordinating through crystal-clear communications. The radar stations on the English coast have already vectored him toward incoming German bombers. His 2,000 horsepower engine propels him at 400 miles per hour, 4 times faster than Luke's biplane. Blakesley glances at his instrument panel, a constellation of gauges monitoring fuel mixture, manifold pressure, oil temperature, all feeding information to a pilot cocooned in metal and technology. When he opens fire, his guns will unleash 6,000 rounds per minute, enough firepower to disintegrate a German fighter in 2 seconds. This is aerial combat in 1943, an industrialized killing machine where technology matters more than courage.
The transformation from Luke's fragile biplane to Blakesley's armored fighter represents the most dramatic technological revolution in military history. In just 25 years, aircraft evolved from wood and fabric contraptions that could barely stay airborne into all-metal warbirds that dominated the skies. But the change was not just in the machines, it was in everything. Tactics, training, weapons, communications, navigation, survival equipment, and the very nature of aerial warfare itself. To understand this revolution, we must first understand where it began. In the mud and blood of World War I, where aircraft were still regarded as curiosities, and where pilots went to war in machines that had more in common with bicycles than with the fighters that would rule World War II. When World War I erupted in August 1914, military aviation was barely a decade old. The Wright brothers had achieved powered flight only 11 years earlier. Most generals regarded aircraft as expensive toys, useful perhaps for reconnaissance, but certainly not for combat. The first military aircraft were unarmed observation planes, their pilots and observers waving at enemy aircraft as they passed, sometimes even exchanging friendly gestures. It seemed ungentlemanly to shoot at fellow aviators. That innocence lasted approximately 3 weeks. By September 1914, pilots were carrying pistols, then rifles, then mounting machine guns on improvised mounts. The race to weaponize aircraft had begun. But the technology lagged far behind the ambition. The aircraft of 1914 were primitive beyond modern comprehension. The typical reconnaissance plane was a fabric-covered biplane with a wooden frame.
powered by an engine producing between 70 and 100 horsepower. Top speed rarely exceeded 70 miles per hour. Service ceiling, the maximum altitude at which the aircraft could maintain level flight, hovered around 10,000 feet, and reaching that height required 30 minutes of laborious climbing. The pilot sat in an open cockpit exposed to wind, rain, and cold. There were no parachutes. Military authorities considered them cowardly, and besides, the additional weight might affect performance. Instruments were minimal, perhaps a compass, an airspeed indicator of dubious accuracy, and an altimeter. Navigation relied on following roads and rivers. Getting lost was common. Flying in clouds was suicidal. Night flying was almost impossible.
The engines were the greatest weakness. Most were rotary designs, where the entire engine block spun around a fixed crankshaft, the propeller attached directly to the spinning engine. This produced tremendous gyroscopic forces that made aircraft difficult to control. The Gnome monosoupape engine, widely used by Allied forces, burned castor oil that sprayed back into the pilot's face, causing chronic digestive problems for aviators. Engine reliability was abysmal. A flight of more than 2 hours was considered pushing one's luck. Forced landings due to mechanical failure were so common that pilots carried tools to effect field repairs. The life expectancy of engines was measured in tens of hours before complete overhaul was required. Armament presented enormous challenges. Early attempts to mount machine guns on aircraft failed because there was no good place to put them. Pusher aircraft, with the engine behind the pilot, could mount a gun firing forward, but these designs were slow and ungainly. Tractor aircraft, with the engine in front, were faster, but the propeller blocked the line of fire. Some pilots tried mounting guns to fire at oblique angles, others attached them to the upper wing to fire over the propeller arc. All solutions were awkward and ineffective. The breakthrough came in April 1915, when French pilot Roland Garros attached deflector plates to his propeller blades, allowing bullets to ricochet off the blades without destroying them. It was crude but functional. Garros shot down 5 German aircraft in 2 weeks before being forced down behind enemy lines. The Germans, examining Garros's captured aircraft, tasked their Dutch engineer, Anthony Fokker, with creating a better solution. Within days, Fokker perfected the interrupter gear, a mechanical linkage that synchronized machine gun fire with propeller rotation, allowing bullets to pass between the spinning blades. The Fokker II Eindecker, armed with a single synchronized machine gun, created the first true fighter aircraft. For 6 months in late 1915 and early 1916, the period known as the Fokker Scourge, German pilots achieved air superiority over the Western Front. Allied aircraft fell from the sky in unprecedented numbers. The average life expectancy of a British pilot arriving in France dropped to 11 days.
But the technology was evolving rapidly, driven by the desperate demands of total war. By 1916, both sides had developed synchronization gear. Aircraft designs improved incrementally. The introduction of the Sopwith Pup and later the Sopwith Camel gave the British fast, maneuverable fighters. The French developed the SPAD series, sturdy and fast, though less agile. The Germans countered with the Albatros D series and later the Fokker Dr.I triplane, immortalized by the Red Baron. Yet, despite these advances, World War I fighters remained fundamentally primitive. They were still fabric-covered biplanes with wooden frames. Speeds rarely exceeded 120 miles per hour. Service ceilings topped out around 20,000 feet, and few aircraft could reach that altitude with any combat effectiveness. Armament typically consisted of 1 or 2 rifle-caliber machine guns, with perhaps 500 rounds per gun. That gave a pilot about 30 seconds of firing time before ammunition was exhausted. The pilot's experience in a World War I fighter was almost unimaginably harsh. Sitting in an open cockpit at 15,000 feet, temperatures dropped to 20 or 30 degrees below zero. The wind chill at 100 miles per hour made it far worse. Pilots wore leather coats, boots, helmets, and gloves, but frostbite was endemic. Many pilots suffered permanent damage to their hands and faces. The cold was so severe that machine guns frequently jammed, their oil congealing into useless sludge. Some pilots urinated on their guns before takeoff, the warm liquid keeping the mechanisms functional for a few extra minutes. The castor oil from rotary engines sprayed continuously into pilots' faces, coating their goggles and causing chronic diarrhea that left them weak and dehydrated. There was no oxygen equipment. Above 15,000 feet, hypoxia set in gradually, clouding judgment and slowing reactions. Many pilots blacked out at high altitude, their aircraft spiraling into fatal dives. There were no radios. Once airborne, a pilot was utterly alone, unable to communicate with ground forces or fellow aviators. Hand signals and waggling wings were the only means of communication between aircraft. There were no parachutes. When an aircraft caught fire, and they caught fire easily with fabric skin and fuel tanks positioned directly in front of the pilot, the aviator faced a choice: burn to death or jump. Many chose to jump.
Navigation was primitive beyond belief. Maps were crude and often inaccurate. Pilots navigated by dead reckoning, attempting to maintain heading and speed while accounting for wind drift. Frequently, they failed. Running out of fuel over enemy territory was common. Flying in clouds meant flying blind, with no instruments capable of maintaining level flight. Spatial disorientation killed countless pilots who became lost in cloud banks and crashed while believing they were flying leveled. Night flying was rarely attempted and almost always ended in disaster. Without lighted runways or navigation aids, finding one's way home in darkness was nearly impossible. Combat tactics in World War I evolved through trial and error, written in blood across the skies of France. Initially, aircraft simply flew toward each other and blazed away, hoping for hits. This proved ineffective and suicidal. Gradually, tactics emerged. The German ace Oswald Boelcke codified the first systematic approach to air combat in his Dicta Boelcke, 8 rules that emphasized altitude advantage, surprise, and attacking from the sun. British and French pilots developed their own tactical doctrines. By 1917, formations had grown from individual aircraft to flights of 4 or 6, and eventually to squadrons of 12 or more aircraft working in coordination. The most successful tactic was the diving attack from superior altitude. Height meant energy, and energy meant life. Pilots climbed laboriously to gain altitude advantage, then dived on unsuspecting enemies, firing a burst and zooming back to altitude before the enemy could react. The maneuver required precise timing and nerve. Dive too steeply, and the fabric wings might tear off. Pull out too late, and the aircraft would auger into the ground. Many pilots died learning these limits. Dogfighting, the twisting, turning battles that captured public imagination, was actually a sign of failure. It meant a pilot had been surprised or had made a tactical error. Good pilots killed without warning and escaped before the enemy knew they were there. The weapons themselves were maddeningly unreliable. The Vickers and Lewis machine guns used by Allied forces and the Spandau and Parabellum guns used by Germans all suffered from frequent jams. Dirty ammunition, cold temperatures, and the vibration of aircraft engines all contributed to malfunctions. Pilots developed elaborate procedures to clear jams, manipulating charging handles while flying with their knees, but often the guns simply quit working. Many combats ended with both aircraft circling impotently, their weapons jammed, pilots gesturing in frustration. Some pilots carried hammers to beat their guns back into function. Ammunition was another limitation. With only 500 rounds per gun, pilots learned to fire in short bursts, 2 or 3 seconds at most, conserving ammunition for the moment when a killing shot presented itself. Marksmanship was critical. There were no tracer rounds to show where bullets were going, at least not early in the war. Pilots aimed by instinct and experience, learning to lead their targets and account for bullet drop and wind drift. Most fired from suicidally close range, 50 yards or less, ensuring hits but risking collision or being struck by debris from the disintegrating enemy aircraft. The psychological strain was immense. Death came suddenly and often. A pilot might be laughing with friends at breakfast and burning to death by lunch. The life expectancy of new pilots on the Western Front was measured in weeks. Some squadrons lost their entire roster of pilots in a single month, replaced with fresh-faced boys who would themselves be dead before they learned to survive. The constant stress, the cold, the castor oil poisoning, the lack of sleep, all combined to create a unique form of combat fatigue. Many pilots developed nervous disorders, their hands shaking uncontrollably, their judgment impaired. Some simply refused to fly, facing courts-martial rather than return to the sky. Yet despite the primitive technology and horrific conditions, World War I pilots achieved remarkable feats. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, scored 80 confirmed victories before his death in April 1918. René Fonck of France claimed 75 victories and survived the war. British ace Edward Manock scored 61 victories. These men were not superhumans. They were simply pilots who learned the lessons of aerial combat and lived long enough to apply them. They understood energy management, the conversion of altitude into speed and speed into altitude. They understood deflection shooting, leading a target to account for its motion. They understood the importance of surprise and the danger of complacency. Most importantly, they understood their aircraft's capabilities and limitations, flying right at the edge of what was possible, but never beyond it. The aircraft themselves reached their evolutionary peak by 1918. The Sopwith Camel, perhaps the most famous fighter of the war, entered service in mid-1917. It was a compact biplane, powered by a rotary engine, producing 130 horsepower, giving it a top speed of 113 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 19,000 feet. Armed with 2 synchronized Vickers machine guns, it was deadly in skilled hands, but it was also unforgiving. The heavy rotary engine created such powerful gyroscopic forces that the aircraft could flip onto its back in an instant if mishandled. The Camel killed more pilots in training accidents than any other aircraft. Yet in combat, it was supreme, claiming more victories than any other Allied fighter. Over 1,300 enemy aircraft fell to Camel pilots, a testament to both the aircraft's capabilities and its pilots' skill. The German Fokker D7, introduced in the spring of 1918, was perhaps the finest fighter of the war. Powered by a 185-horsepower BMW engine, it could reach 124 miles per hour and climb to 20,000 feet. Its thick airfoil wings generated tremendous lift, allowing it to hang on its propeller and shoot upward at angles other fighters could not match. Allied pilots feared the D7 more than any other German aircraft. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, one of the specific terms required Germany to surrender all Fokker D7s to the Allies, the only aircraft singled out by name in the treaty. By the war's end, aerial combat had matured into a deadly science. Tactics had evolved from individual duels to large-scale formations engaging in coordinated battles. Technology had advanced from unarmed observation planes to purpose-built fighters carrying synchronized machine guns. Yet the fundamental limitations remained. Aircraft were still slow, fragile,
and limited in range and firepower. Pilots still flew in open cockpits without parachutes, radios, or sophisticated instruments. The technology had reached the limits of what was possible with fabric-covered wooden biplanes powered by temperamental rotary engines. Further progress required fundamentally new approaches, new materials, new engines, new everything.
The armistice of November 11, 1918, brought an abrupt end to military aviation development. Governments, exhausted by 4 years of total war, slashed military budgets. Aircraft factories closed, squadrons disbanded. Thousands of combat aircraft were scrapped or sold as surplus. The great aces returned home to uncertain futures, their skills suddenly obsolete in a world at peace. But the lessons learned over the Western Front were not forgotten. In offices and workshops across Europe and America, engineers and designers studied the war's legacy, analyzing what had worked and what had failed, planning the next generation of combat aircraft. They did not know when the next war would come, but they knew it would come. And when it did, they were determined that their aircraft would dominate the skies as thoroughly as Fokker D-7s had dominated 1918. What they could not predict was how completely the technology would transform. The biplane fighters of 1918 represented the pinnacle of their design philosophy, but that philosophy was about to be rendered obsolete. In the 2 decades between the world wars, aircraft would undergo a revolution so profound that a World War I pilot transported to 1940 would barely recognize the machines as aircraft at all. Metal would replace wood, monoplanes would replace biplanes. Enclosed cockpits would replace open pits. Radios, oxygen systems, retractable landing gear, variable pitch propellers, superchargers, and 100 other innovations would transform aircraft from fragile kites into screaming engines of war. The revolution was coming, driven by peacetime racing competitions, by airmail routes pushing the limits of reliability, by visionary designers who understood that the future belonged to speed and altitude and firepower beyond anything World War I had imagined.
The years between 1918 and 1939 witnessed a technological revolution that would have been incomprehensible to the pilots who fought over the Western Front. The fabric-covered biplanes that dominated World War I gave way to sleek all-metal monoplanes that flew twice as fast, twice as high, and carried 10 times the firepower. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was driven by racing competitions, commercial aviation, and military planners who understood that the next war would be won by whoever controlled the skies. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the stage was set for aerial combat on a scale and intensity that would have terrified the aces of 1918. The first major breakthrough came in materials. Wood and fabric, the building blocks of World War I aircraft, had reached their limits. Above certain speeds, fabric would tear from the airframe. Wooden spars would crack under stress loads. The solution was metal, specifically aluminum alloys that offered strength without excessive weight. The Germans led this transition with the Junkers JI, an all-metal ground attack aircraft introduced in 1917, but it was heavy and slow. Through the 1920s, metallurgy advanced rapidly. American engineer John Northrop pioneered the use of stressed skin construction, where the metal skin of the aircraft carried structural loads rather than just covering a framework. This allowed for thinner, lighter, stronger airframes. By the early 1930s, all-metal construction had become standard for military aircraft. The shift from biplanes to monoplanes was equally dramatic. Biplanes offered excellent lift and maneuverability. Their double wings generated tremendous aerodynamic forces, but they also created massive drag, limiting speed. Monoplanes, with their single wing, produced far less drag and could achieve much higher speeds. But early monoplane designs lacked the structural strength to handle combat stresses. The breakthrough came with cantilever wing designs, where the wing was supported entirely from within, requiring no external bracing wires. This eliminated drag and allowed for clean, streamlined designs.
The Supermarine S-6B racing seaplane, which won the Schneider Trophy in 1931 with a speed of 340 miles per hour, proved that monoplanes could be both fast and structurally sound. That aircraft's designer, R.J. Mitchell, would later create the Supermarine Spitfire.
Engine development was perhaps the most critical advance. The rotary engines of World War I, with their spinning engine blocks and castor oil spray, were obsolete by the early 1920s. They were replaced by static radial engines, where the cylinders were arranged in a circle around a fixed crankshaft, and inline engines, where cylinders were arranged in rows. Both designs were far more powerful and reliable than their predecessors. By the mid-1930s, engines producing over 1,000 horsepower were common. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, which would power both the Spitfire and the Hurricane, produced 1,030 horsepower in its initial version and would eventually be developed to produce over 2,000 horsepower. German Daimler-Benz engines achieved similar outputs. These massive increases in power enabled aircraft to fly faster and higher while carrying heavier weapons and armor. Supercharging was another critical innovation. At high altitudes, the thin air contains less oxygen, reducing engine power dramatically. World War I fighters struggled above 15,000 feet. But superchargers, essentially air compressors driven by the engine, could force more air into the cylinders, maintaining power output at altitude. By 1940, fighters equipped with two-stage superchargers could maintain combat effectiveness above 30,000 feet, double the ceiling of their World War I predecessors. This opened up entirely new tactical possibilities. Height meant energy, and energy meant life, just as it had in 1918. But now aircraft could fight effectively at altitudes where World War I pilots would have passed out from hypoxia. Propeller technology advanced in parallel with engines. The fixed-pitch wooden propellers of World War I were inefficient, optimized for either takeoff or high-speed flight, but not both. Variable pitch propellers, where the blade angle could be adjusted in flight, solved this problem. A fine pitch for takeoff provided maximum thrust at low speeds. A coarse pitch for high-speed flight reduced drag and increased efficiency. By the late 1930s, constant speed propellers that automatically adjusted pitch to maintain optimal engine RPM had become standard. These innovations improved performance across the entire flight envelope, giving World War II fighters capabilities that would have seemed magical to World War I pilots. Retractable landing gear was another seemingly simple innovation with profound effects. Fixed landing gear created enormous drag, limiting top speed. Retractable gear, which folded into the wings or fuselage after takeoff, cleaned up the aircraft's profile and dramatically improved performance. The difference was startling. A fighter with fixed gear might reach 250 miles per hour. The same airframe with retractable gear could achieve 350 miles per hour. Early retractable gear systems were manually operated, requiring pilots to crank a handle dozens of times to raise or lower the wheels. Later systems used hydraulics or electric motors. By 1939, virtually all new fighters featured retractable landing gear. The cockpit environment underwent an equally dramatic transformation. World War I pilots had frozen in open cockpits, breathing whatever thin air was available, with minimal instruments and no protection from the elements. World War II pilots sat in enclosed, heated cockpits with sophisticated instrument panels. Oxygen systems allowed them to operate effectively at high altitudes without hypoxia. Radios enabled communication with ground controllers and fellow pilots, coordinating attacks and providing early warning of enemy formations. The psychological difference was enormous. A World War I pilot was alone once he left the ground. A World War II pilot was part of an integrated system, receiving information and support throughout his mission.
Armament advances were staggering. World War I fighters typically carried 2 rifle-caliber machine guns with 500 rounds each. World War II fighters carried batteries of guns with thousands of rounds of ammunition. The British Spitfire and Hurricane initially mounted 8 .303 caliber Browning machine guns, each with 300 rounds, for a total of 2,400 rounds. Later Marks added 20mm cannons. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW190 carried combinations of machine guns and cannons, with the FW190A8 mounting 2 13mm machine guns and 4 20mm cannons. American fighters took a different approach. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 50 caliber machine guns with 3,400 rounds total, creating a cone of fire that could shred enemy aircraft in seconds.
The difference in destructive power was almost incomprehensible. A World War I pilot who scored a hit might see fabric tear and wood splinter, but many aircraft absorbed dozens of hits and continued flying. World War II weapons were designed to destroy all metal aircraft. Armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could penetrate armor plate and detonate inside the aircraft, igniting fuel tanks and ammunition. High explosive rounds detonated on impact, creating blast waves that could break structural members. A 2-second burst from a World War II fighter could deliver more destructive power than a World War I pilot might fire in his entire combat career. Ammunition capacity meant pilots could engage multiple targets in a single sortie, whereas World War I pilots husbanded their limited ammunition, firing only when certain of a hit. World War II pilots could afford to fire longer bursts and engage at greater ranges. Gun cameras, introduced in the late 1930s, automatically photographed the target when guns were fired, providing proof of claims and allowing pilots to analyze their attacks. Synchronized guns, which had been cutting-edge technology in 1915, were now standard and utterly reliable, firing thousands of rounds without jamming. Fire control systems also advanced dramatically. World War I pilots aimed by instinct, with crude ring and bead sights providing minimal assistance. World War II fighters featured gyroscopic gun sights that calculated deflection angles automatically, helping pilots lead their targets correctly. The British developed the Mark II gyro gun sight, which projected an illuminated reticle onto a reflector glass. The pilot simply kept the target within the reticle, and the sight calculated the correct lead angle based on target range, speed, and turn rate. This technology transformed gunnery from an art into a science, allowing average pilots to achieve hits that would have required exceptional skill in World War I. Navigation technology had progressed beyond recognition. World War I pilots navigated by following roads and rivers, frequently getting lost. World War II pilots had access to radio navigation beacons that transmitted signals pilots could home in on, direction-finding equipment that could locate radio transmitters, and, in some cases, primitive radar systems. British fighters were guided by ground controllers using radar to track both friendly and enemy aircraft, vectoring fighters onto targets with precision impossible in World War I. The Germans developed similar systems. By 1944, some night fighters carried airborne radar that allowed them to detect bombers in complete darkness from miles away. The introduction of radar fundamentally changed aerial warfare. British chain-home radar stations, operational by 1938, could detect aircraft approaching from over 100 miles away, providing early warning that allowed fighters to scramble and climb to intercept altitude before enemy bombers arrived. This system, combined with radio communications and ground-controlled interception, created an integrated air defense network that maximized the effectiveness of limited fighter resources. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, radar allowed the RAF to focus their fighters precisely where needed, rather than flying standing patrols that wasted fuel and exhausted pilots. Aircraft performance had reached levels that would have been dismissed as fantasy in 1918. The Supermarine Spitfire, entering service in 1938, had a top speed of 362 miles per hour, more than 3 times faster than a Sopwith Camel.
Its service ceiling was 37,000 feet, nearly double that of World War I fighters. Its rate of climb, over 2,600 feet per minute initially and improving with later marks, allowed it to reach 20,000 feet in less than 8 minutes, compared to the 30 minutes a World War I fighter might require. Its range, while limited by the standards of later aircraft, was over 400 miles, allowing operations far from base. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's primary fighter throughout World War II, achieved similar performance. The Bf 109E, which fought in the Battle of Britain, could reach 354 miles per hour and climb to 36,000 feet. Its armament of two 7.92 mm machine guns and two 20 mm cannons gave it tremendous firepower. Later variants were even more capable. The Bf 109G could reach 400 miles per hour and operate above 40,000 feet. German pilots praised its powerful engine, excellent high-altitude performance, and heavy armament, though they complained about its narrow landing gear and poor visibility from the cockpit. American fighters embodied a different design philosophy. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a brute force design, heavy and powerful. Weighing over 10,000 pounds empty, it was twice the weight of a Spitfire, but its massive 2,000 horsepower engine gave it a top speed of 433 miles per hour and the ability to dive faster than any other propeller-driven fighter. Its 850 caliber machine guns created a devastating cone of fire. Most importantly, it could absorb incredible battle damage and continue flying. Pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and it earned a reputation as the toughest fighter in the sky.
The North American P-51 Mustang, perhaps the finest all-around fighter of the war, combined speed, range, and firepower in an elegant package. With a top speed over 440 miles per hour, a service ceiling above 41,000 feet, and, most critically, a range of over 1,600 miles with external tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers deep into Germany and still have fuel for combat. Its 650 caliber machine guns and excellent handling made it deadly in dogfights. German pilots learned to fear the Mustang more than any other Allied fighter. By 1944, formations of Mustangs ranged freely over Germany, destroying Luftwaffe fighters on the ground and in the air, achieving air superiority that made continued German resistance nearly impossible. Tactical doctrines had evolved as dramatically as the aircraft themselves. World War I tactics emphasized individual combat and small formations. World War II tactics were built around large formations working in close coordination. The Germans developed the Finger 4 formation, where 4 aircraft flew in a pattern resembling the fingertips of an outstretched hand, each pilot covering his wingman. This formation allowed mutual support while maintaining flexibility. The Allies initially flew tight V formations inherited from World War I, but combat losses forced them to adopt looser, more flexible formations similar to German practices. Energy tactics, pioneered by World War I aces like Oswald Boelcke, became formalized doctrine. Altitude was energy, and energy was life. Fighters climbed to gain altitude advantage before engaging, then converted that altitude into speed by diving on enemies below. The boom and zoom tactic, attacking from high altitude at high speed and then zooming back to altitude without turning to dogfight, became standard procedure, especially for heavy American fighters like the P-47 and P-38. German pilots flying more maneuverable aircraft often tried to force turning engagements where their superior agility gave them advantage, but experienced Allied pilots learned to refuse these fights, using their speed to disengage and reset the engagement on their terms. The scale of aerial combat had expanded beyond anything imaginable in World War I. The Battle of Britain, fought from July to October 1940, involved thousands of sorties and hundreds of aircraft in single engagements. On August 15th, the heaviest day of the battle, the Luftwaffe flew over 2,000 sorties against Britain.
Fighter Command responded with hundreds of Spitfires and Hurricanes, engaging in massive dogfights across southern England. The largest World War I air battle, the massed fighter sweeps of 1918, might involve 50 aircraft total. World War II battles routinely involved hundreds.
The strategic bombing campaigns of World War II created aerial battles of unprecedented intensity. American B-17 and B-24 bomber formations, sometimes numbering over 1,000 aircraft, penetrated deep into Germany, escorted by hundreds of fighters. The Luftwaffe responded with mass attacks by their own fighters, leading to enormous air battles. On October 14, 1943, during the raid on Schweinfurt, American bombers and escorts engaged over 300 German fighters in a running battle lasting hours. 60 American bombers were shot down, along with dozens of fighters on both sides. Such carnage would have consumed entire air forces in World War I. In World War II, it was a single day's operations. Night fighting became a specialized art. World War I aircraft were almost incapable of night operations. World War II saw the development of dedicated night fighters, equipped with radar, specialized instruments, and crews trained for operations in complete darkness. British night fighters like the Bristol Beaufighter and later the de Havilland Mosquito hunted German bombers through the night skies over England. German night fighters, equipped with increasingly sophisticated radar and tactics, exacted a terrible toll on RAF bomber streams over Germany. By 1944, night fighting had become as systematic and deadly as daylight operations, with entire squadrons dedicated to operations in darkness. Ground attack, a minor role in World War I, became a primary mission for fighters in World War II. Aircraft like the Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik, the German U-87 Stuka, and later versions of the P-47 Thunderbolt and Hawker Typhoon were optimized for attacking ground targets. They carried rockets, bombs, and heavy cannons that could destroy tanks, trucks, trains, and buildings. The impact on ground operations was enormous. German armored columns that might have advanced rapidly in World War I found themselves pinned down by constant air attacks. The breakout from Normandy after D-Day was enabled largely by Allied air superiority, with fighters and fighter bombers destroying German units attempting to reinforce the front. Pilot training had also evolved dramatically. World War I pilots often arrived at the front with minimal training, perhaps 20 or 30 hours of flight time, and were expected to learn combat skills on the job. Many died in their first few missions. World War II training programs were far more comprehensive. By 1943, American fighter pilots received over 400 hours of training before entering combat, including extensive gunnery practice, aerobatics, instrument flying, formation flying, and tactical instruction. They practiced against experienced instructors flying captured enemy aircraft, learning the capabilities and vulnerabilities of the planes they would face. They studied gun camera footage from actual combat, analyzed tactics, and received thorough briefings on enemy capabilities. The results were clear. American pilots arriving in Europe in 1944 were far better prepared than their 1942 counterparts, and infinitely better trained than the German pilots they faced. The Luftwaffe, bleeding experienced pilots in massive battles of attrition, was forced to send poorly trained replacements into combat with as little as 50 hours of total flight time. These boys stood no chance against veteran Allied pilots flying superior aircraft. The kill ratios reflected this disparity. By late 1944, experienced American pilots in P-51 Mustangs were achieving kill ratios of 10-to-1 or better against German fighters.
The gulf between World War I and World War II fighters was not just technological, but philosophical. World War I aviation was artisanal.
Aircraft were built in small shops by craftsmen. Pilots were individuals, aces, whose personal skill determined success or failure. Tactics were learned through experience and passed down informally. World War II aviation was industrial. Aircraft were mass-produced in enormous factories by assembly line workers. Pilots were products of systematic training programs. Tactics were codified in manuals and taught formally. The transition from individual skill to systematic process mirrored the broader transformation of warfare itself. The numbers tell the story starkly. In World War I, Germany produced approximately 48,000 aircraft of all types from 1914 to 1918. Britain produced about 55,000. France produced around 68,000. These numbers, impressive for their time, pale beside World War II production. The United States alone produced over 300,000 aircraft during World War II. Germany produced approximately 120,000 military aircraft. Britain produced over 130,000. The Soviet Union, despite losing much of its industrial capacity to German invasion, still produced over 150,000 aircraft. Japan produced nearly 80,000. The scale of production reflected the total mobilization of industrial economies for aerial warfare. Aircraft that would have been considered marvels in 1918 rolled off assembly lines by the hundreds each day in 1944. The cost in human life was equally staggering. World War I aviation casualties, while significant, were measured in thousands. Approximately 8,000 British airmen died during the war. German aviation losses were similar. World War II aviation casualties dwarfed these numbers. The United States Army Air Forces alone suffered over 52,000 combat deaths. RAF Bomber Command lost 55,000 aircrew killed. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 70,000 aircrew. Soviet aviation losses exceeded 100,000. Japanese aviation casualties approached 60,000. The expansion of aerial warfare from a minor supporting role to a major component of military operations brought corresponding increases in casualties that would have been unimaginable to World War I commanders.
Survival rates reflected both the increased lethality of combat and the improvements in equipment. World War I pilots who were shot down almost always died. There were no parachutes. Aircraft that caught fire burned quickly, giving pilots no chance to escape. Those who survived crashes often died from injuries that would be treatable today. World War II pilots had parachutes, mandatory equipment that saved thousands of lives. They had better survival equipment, including life rafts for operations over water, better clothing, better medical support. Yet the weapons were so much more lethal that survival was still uncertain. A burst from 8 50 caliber machine guns or a hit from a 20mm cannon could destroy an aircraft in seconds. Pilots who bailed out over enemy territory faced capture. Those who bailed out over the ocean faced exposure and drowning. Those who crashed often died despite their safety equipment. The technology gap between World War I and World War II fighters can be illustrated through direct comparison. The Sopwith Camel, one of the finest fighters of 1918, had a top speed of 113 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 19,000 feet, a range of about 300 miles, and an armament of 2 rifle-caliber machine guns with 500 rounds each. The aircraft weighed 1,453 pounds empty and was constructed of wood and fabric. It had no radio, no oxygen system, no cockpit heating, minimal instruments, and no armor protection. The pilot sat in an open cockpit exposed to temperatures that could reach 30 degrees below zero at altitude. The engine produced 130 horsepower and was notoriously unreliable, routinely operating for hundreds of hours between overhauls.
The performance differences translated directly into combat effectiveness. A Sopwith Camel climbing to 15,000 feet required approximately 25 minutes. A P-51 Mustang could reach the same altitude in under 7 minutes. The Camels' 2 machine guns, firing at 500 rounds per minute, each could deliver 1,000 rounds per minute total for approximately 30 seconds before ammunition was exhausted. The Mustang's 6 machine guns, firing at 800 rounds per minute each, delivered 4,800 rounds per minute for over 23 seconds of sustained fire. But the real difference was in the ammunition itself. The Camels' .303 British rounds were designed for infantry rifles, adapted for aircraft use. The Mustang's .50 caliber rounds were purpose-designed for aerial combat, with armor-piercing incendiary rounds that could penetrate armor plate and ignite fuel tanks. The Camel's fabric-covered wooden structure offered no protection. A single bullet through the fuel tank meant fire. A bullet through a structural member meant possible catastrophic failure. The Mustang's all-metal construction and self-sealing fuel tanks meant it could absorb significant battle damage and continue flying. Pilots routinely returned from missions with dozens of bullet holes in their aircraft. One famous P-51 returned with over 400 holes from flak and machine gun fire, yet the pilot landed safely. Such damage would have destroyed a Camel instantly. The tactical implications of these technological differences were profound. A World War I dogfight between a Camel and a Fokker D-7 was a contest of individual skill. Both aircraft had similar performance. Success depended on pilot ability to outmaneuver the opponent, gain a firing position, and deliver accurate fire with limited ammunition. The fight might last several minutes as aircraft circled and climbed and dove, each pilot seeking advantage. A World War II encounter between a P-51 Mustang and a Messerschmitt Bf 109 was often over in seconds. The aircraft were so fast that opportunities for shooting lasted only moments. The enormous firepower meant a single burst could be lethal. Pilots who hesitated or misjudged were dead before they realized their mistake.
Energy management, the art of converting altitude into speed and speed into altitude, became far more critical with the higher performance of World War II fighters. A World War I fighter diving from 15,000 feet might reach 150 miles per hour before needing to pull out to avoid structural failure or ground impact. A World War II fighter diving from 30,000 feet could reach 500 miles per hour or more, and could convert that speed back into a zoom climb that would carry it to 35,000 feet or higher. The ability to manage these energy exchanges separated expert pilots from novices. German ace Adolf Galland described it as flying in the vertical rather than the horizontal, using the third dimension of altitude as both weapon and defense. The advent of compressibility effects at high speeds introduced entirely new aerodynamic phenomena. World War I aircraft never flew fast enough to encounter compressibility, where shock waves form on the wings and control surfaces become ineffective. World War II fighters regularly encountered these effects in high-speed dives. Pilots learned to recognize the buffeting and loss of control that signaled approaching the speed of sound. Some aircraft handled compressibility better than others. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its thick wings and robust construction, could dive faster than any other propeller fighter and recover safely. Lighter aircraft like the P-51 Mustang required more careful handling. Some pilots, diving too aggressively, lost control and crashed when their aircraft entered compressibility, and they could not recover. Radio communications transformed tactics in ways impossible to overstate. World War I pilots were alone once airborne, unable to coordinate with anyone. World War II pilots maintained constant communication with ground controllers and fellow pilots. British fighters during the Battle of Britain were directed by ground controllers who could see both friendly and enemy formations on radar, vectoring fighters to intercept bombers and warning them of enemy fighters. This force multiplication meant that outnumbered British fighters could be concentrated at critical points, engaging German formations with local superiority, despite overall numerical disadvantage. Without radar and radio, the British would have needed 3 times as many fighters to achieve the same coverage.
In the Pacific theater, radio communications enabled entirely new tactical approaches. American fighters protecting carrier task forces were directed by radar controllers aboard ships, guiding them to intercept incoming Japanese attackers. Japanese pilots, often flying without radios or with unreliable equipment, found themselves ambushed repeatedly by American fighters that seemed to know exactly where they were. The disparity in information gave American forces an overwhelming advantage. Even when Japanese pilots had superior skill or aircraft performance, they were often defeated by American forces that had better information and coordination. The psychological differences between World War I and World War II pilots were also significant. World War I pilots were volunteers, often from upper-class backgrounds, educated men who saw aviation as a gentleman's pursuit. There was a romanticism to aerial combat, a sense of chivalry that persisted despite the reality of burning aircraft and men dying in agony. Pilots on both sides sometimes showed respect for enemy aces, dropping wreaths over their airfields when a famous pilot was killed. This romanticism faded as the war dragged on and losses mounted, but it never entirely disappeared. World War II aviation had no room for romanticism. The scale of operations, the industrial nature of warfare, the massive casualties, all combined to eliminate any sense of chivalry. Pilots were professionals doing a job. Enemy pilots were targets to be destroyed, not opponents to be respected. The weapons were so lethal and combat so intense that there was no opportunity for gestures of respect. Moreover, World War II pilots understood the stakes in ways their predecessors had not. This was a war of annihilation. Losing meant not just defeat, but potential genocide. There was no room for mercy or romanticism. Pilots shot at parachuting enemies, strafed survivors in life rafts, attacked hospital ships and ambulances. The rules of warfare that had constrained World War I combat disappeared in the face of total war. Training reflected this professionalization. World War I pilots learned to fly in a few hours, received minimal instruction in combat tactics, and were sent to the front to learn by doing. Those who survived became aces. Those who didn't became statistics. World War II training programs were systematic and comprehensive. American pilot training began with classification tests to determine aptitude. Successful candidates entered primary training, learning basic flying skills in simple aircraft. They then progressed to basic training in more complex aircraft, learning aerobatics, formation flying, and instrument flying. Advanced training introduced them to high-performance fighters, where they practiced gunnery, combat tactics, and high-altitude operations. The entire program took over a year and produced pilots who were competent before they ever saw combat. The Germans, British, and Soviets had similar training pipelines, though the Soviets emphasized speed over thoroughness, graduating pilots more quickly but with less comprehensive training. The Japanese initially had excellent training programs, producing highly skilled pilots who dominated early Pacific battles. But as losses mounted and resources dwindled, Japanese training quality collapsed. By 1944, Japanese pilots were entering combat with as little as 40 hours of total flight time, including only a handful of hours in the aircraft they would fly in combat. These poorly trained pilots stood no chance against veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft, resulting in massacres like the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American pilots shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft in 2 days for minimal losses. The technological superiority of World War II fighters extended to every aspect of their design. Hydraulic systems powered landing gear, flaps, and sometimes weapons, replacing the manual systems of World War I aircraft. Electrical systems powered radios, instruments, gun heaters, and cockpit lights. Fuel systems included pumps, filters, and gauges that ensured reliable engine operation.
Self-sealing fuel tanks, using rubber layers that swelled when punctured to close holes, saved countless lives by preventing fires. Armor protection, including steel plates and bulletproof glass, gave pilots a chance to survive hits that would have been fatal in World War I aircraft.
Instruments transformed pilot capabilities. World War I pilots had perhaps 5 instruments: compass, airspeed indicator, altimeter, tachometer, and oil pressure gauge. World War II pilots had dozens of instruments providing comprehensive information about aircraft performance and condition. The artificial horizon allowed flight in clouds without spatial disorientation. The radio compass showed direction to navigation beacons. The fuel gauge, oil temperature, cylinder head temperature, manifold pressure, and numerous other instruments gave pilots complete awareness of their aircraft's condition. This information allowed pilots to operate safely in conditions that would have been suicidal in World War I. Night flight, cloud flight, and long-range navigation all became routine rather than extraordinary. The oxygen systems that allowed high-altitude operations were themselves marvels of engineering. World War I pilots breathed whatever air was available, suffering hypoxia above 15,000 feet that clouded judgment and slowed reactions. World War II pilots wore oxygen masks connected to bottles of compressed oxygen or to onboard oxygen-generating systems. Regulators ensured they received appropriate oxygen flow for their altitude. At 30,000 feet, where the air pressure is 1/3 of sea level pressure, pilots breathed pure oxygen and functioned normally. This allowed operations at altitudes where World War I pilots would have been unconscious. Heating systems were equally important. World War I pilots froze in open cockpits, suffering frostbite and hypothermia that degraded performance and sometimes caused crashes. World War II pilots sat in heated cockpits. Their flight suits often included electric heating elements. While still cold at extreme altitudes, they were functional and comfortable enough to focus on their mission rather than fighting to stay warm. This seemingly simple improvement had profound effects on pilot effectiveness and morale. The armament systems represented perhaps the most dramatic advances. World War I machine guns were rifle-caliber weapons, typically 7.7 mm or 7.92 mm, firing rounds designed for infantry use. They were effective against fabric-covered wooden aircraft, but required many hits to guarantee a kill. Synchronization gear allowed them to fire through propeller arcs, but the mechanisms were temperamental and prone to failure. Ammunition capacity was severely limited, typically 500 rounds per gun, giving pilots perhaps 30 seconds of firing time before they were defenseless.
World War II fighters carried weapons specifically designed for aerial combat. Heavy machine guns like the American 50-caliber Browning M2 fired rounds nearly twice the diameter of World War I weapons, with correspondingly greater destructive power. Each round weighed over 2 ounces and could penetrate armor plate at combat ranges. Ammunition loads of 300 to 400 rounds per gun, with 6 or 8 guns standard, gave pilots extended firing time. The guns were electrically heated to prevent freezing and were extraordinarily reliable, firing thousands of rounds without jamming. Cannons added even greater destructive power. The 20mm Hispano cannon used by British and American fighters fired explosive shells that detonated on impact, creating blast effects that could sever control cables, rupture fuel tanks, and break structural members. German 30mm cannons were even more devastating. A single hit from a 30mm shell could destroy an engine or blow off a wing. The drawback was limited ammunition, typically 60 to 100 rounds per cannon, but the destructive effect per hit was so great that this was acceptable. Many German pilots preferred cannon-armed aircraft, despite the weight and limited ammunition, because a single successful burst was almost certain to destroy the target. Gun sights evolved from simple ring and bead arrangements to sophisticated computing sights. The British gyroscopic sight, introduced in 1941 and eventually adopted by American forces, automatically calculated lead angle based on target range and rate of turn. The pilot simply kept the target within the illuminated reticle, and the sight ensured bullets would hit. This technology transformed average pilots into effective marksmen, dramatically improving hit rates. German pilots using simpler reflector sights often found themselves outgunned not by superior shooting, but by superior technology that made shooting easier. The introduction of air-to-air rockets in the late war period added another weapon to the fighter pilot's arsenal. The German R-4M rocket, introduced in 1945, allowed fighters to attack bomber formations from beyond defensive gun range. A single R-4M hit could destroy a bomber, and fighters typically carried 24 rockets. Soviet fighters used RS-82 rockets against German aircraft. American fighters experimented with high-velocity aircraft rockets. While accuracy was poor compared to guns, the standoff range and destructive power made rockets effective against large targets like bombers. The evolution of tactics to exploit these technological advances was continuous throughout World War II. Early war tactics, carried over from World War I and interwar thinking, emphasized tight formations and coordinated attacks. Combat quickly revealed these tactics were obsolete. Tight formations limited pilots' ability to scan for threats and made entire formations vulnerable to surprise attack. Loose formations, pioneered by the Germans and eventually adopted by all air forces, gave pilots room to maneuver while maintaining mutual support. The Finger 4 formation, with aircraft spaced widely enough to allow individual maneuvering, but close enough for mutual protection, became standard. Altitude tactics evolved similarly. Early in the war, fighters often patrolled at medium altitudes, conserving fuel and avoiding the extreme cold of high altitude. But combat taught that height was critical. The side with altitude advantage could choose when and how to engage, diving on enemies below with devastating speed advantage. By mid-war, fighters routinely operated at their maximum altitude, accepting the discomfort in fuel consumption because the tactical advantage was overwhelming. Pilots learned to climb to altitude before crossing enemy lines, maintaining energy advantage throughout their mission. The boom and zoom tactic, attacking from high altitude and high speed without entering a sustained dogfight, became doctrine for heavy fighters like the P-47 and P-38. These aircraft could not outturn lighter-axis fighters in sustained combat, but they could dive faster and climb faster, using energy advantage to dictate the terms of engagement. Pilots learned to make a single firing pass, then zoom back to altitude, repeating until the enemy was destroyed or driven off. This tactic maximized the strengths of American fighters while avoiding their weaknesses. Fighter sweeps, where large formations of fighters preceded bomber raids to clear the skies of enemy fighters, became standard practice. The goal was to achieve air superiority by destroying enemy fighters in the air and on the ground before bombers arrived. P-51 Mustangs ranged deep into Germany, attacking Luftwaffe airfields and engaging any fighters that rose to challenge them. By 1944, these sweeps had achieved their goal. Luftwaffe day fighter forces were so depleted that bomber raids often encountered no opposition. The few German fighters that did engage were usually destroyed quickly by numerically superior and better trained American pilots.
Ground attack became a major fighter mission as the war progressed. Fighters carrying bombs and rockets attacked trains, trucks, tanks, ships, and buildings. The P-47 Thunderbolt proved especially effective in this role, its heavy armament and robust construction allowing it to survive the intense anti-aircraft fire encountered at low altitude. Soviet Il-2 Sturmovix, designed specifically for ground attack, carried cannons, rockets, and bombs that destroyed thousands of German vehicles. The impact on ground operations was enormous. German armored forces that had swept across Europe in 1940 and 1941 found themselves pinned down by constant air attacks in 1944 and 1945. Movement in daylight became suicidal. Supply convoys were destroyed. Reinforcements never reached the front. Allied air superiority, achieved by fighters that could outfight German aircraft and then attack ground targets with impunity, was a decisive factor in Germany's defeat.
The ultimate expression of World War II fighter technology came in the final year of the war with the introduction of jet fighters. The Messerschmitt Me-262, entering service in mid-1944, had a top speed of 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than the best propeller fighters. Its four 30mm cannons could destroy a bomber with a single burst. Allied bomber crews feared the Me-262 more than any other German aircraft. But technical problems, fuel shortages, and Hitler's insistence that the aircraft be used as a bomber rather than a fighter limited its impact. Only about 1,400 were built, and fewer than 300 saw combat. Allied pilots learned to attack Me-262s during takeoff and landing when they were vulnerable, and, while the jet achieved some successes, it came too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. The British Gloucester Meteor, entering service in mid-1944, was used primarily against V-1 flying bombs rather than enemy aircraft. It was slower than the Me-262, but more reliable. Both aircraft represented the future of aerial combat, but in World War II, they were curiosities, technological marvels that came too late to matter. The age of propeller fighters was ending, but it had not yet ended when Germany surrendered in May 1945.
The transformation from World War I biplanes to World War II fighters was complete. In 25 years, aircraft had evolved from fragile kites that could barely stay airborne into sophisticated weapon systems that dominated the battlefield. Speed had increased fourfold. Altitude capability had doubled. Firepower had increased tenfold. Reliability had improved from engines that lasted dozens of hours to engines that lasted hundreds. Pilot survival equipment had progressed from nothing to parachutes, armor, and comprehensive safety systems. Navigation had evolved from following roads to radar and radio beacons. Communication had progressed from hand signals to multi-channel radios. The changes were so profound that a World War I pilot transported to 1945 would barely recognize the aircraft as belonging to the same category of machine. Yet, certain fundamentals remained unchanged. Altitude was still life. Energy management still separated experts from novices. Situational awareness, knowing where you were and where the enemy was, remained critical. Marksmanship still mattered. Courage was still required. The technology had transformed, but the human element remained central. Pilots still died when you made mistakes. They still survived through skill and luck. They still pushed their aircraft to the limits of performance and sometimes beyond. The machines had changed utterly, but the men who flew them faced the same fundamental challenges their predecessors had faced over the Western Front. The legacy of this technological revolution extended far beyond World War II. The jet fighters that appeared at war's end would dominate the next generation of aerial combat. The tactics developed in World War II, energy management and formation flying and coordinated attacks, would remain relevant into the jet age. The training programs established during the war would become models for post-war military aviation. The industrial capacity built to produce hundreds of thousands of aircraft would transition to peacetime production of civil aircraft, jump-starting the commercial aviation industry. The pilots who survived World War II would become airline pilots, test pilots, instructors, and leaders of post-war air forces.
But in 1945, as the guns fell silent and the last fighters returned to their bases, the men who had flown them understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented. They had flown aircraft that their fathers could not have imagined. They had fought battles at speeds and altitudes that defied comprehension. They had seen friends die in flames and had survived encounters that should have killed them. They had been part of the greatest transformation in military technology in human history. The quarter-century evolution from fabric-covered biplanes bumbling along at 100 miles per hour to metal fighters screaming through the stratosphere at 400 miles per hour with firepower that could destroy anything in the sky. And when they were asked to compare their experience to that of World War I pilots, they could only shake their heads in wonder. The men who had fought in Sopwith Camels and Fokker Dr.I triplanes had been brave beyond measure, facing death in primitive machines with almost no support. But the technology gap between the wars was so vast that comparison seemed almost meaningless. It was not a matter of better or worse, it was a matter of different universes. The biplane era had ended, the age of the fighter had arrived, and the sky would never be the same. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of aviation history's most dramatic transformations. If this story of technological revolution fascinated you, shocked you, or taught you something new, do us a huge favor. Like this video, share it with someone who loves real military history, and subscribe to this channel because tomorrow we are uncovering another forgotten battlefield where innovation met desperation, where engineers raced against time, and where the gap between old and new technology decided the fate of nations. We research for long hours every day, cross-check every fact, and write every line to make you feel like you are sitting in that cockpit, gripping that stick, hearing the engine roar as history unfolds around you. This is not Hollywood, this is history, raw, real, and relentless. See you in the next video very soon. Take care, and never forget, behind every innovation there was a human cost.